In the MCU, the overarching villain Thanos famously wanted to cut the population of the universe in half in order to ensure that there would be enough resources for everyone. It's a very interesting character study about the willingness to do terrible things for the greater good. It makes Thanos a lot more interesting as a villain and a character because he truly believes he's doing the right thing. And obviously, this has resulted in some memes saying, oh, Thanos is right. What's particularly interesting about this, about his ultimate plan to cause a genocide for the greater good, to make sure that we don't deplete our resources, it's actually very much based in real-life theories, an economic and philosophical and political debate that has been going on for several decades. The real-life version of these discussions and theories talk about resources on Earth. So obviously this is the same debate scaled up to the entire universe, but the basic principles still apply, which is if we don't check our resource consumption and do something to make sure that we're spending resources properly, and that includes making sure we don't overpopulate the earth, and we're going to run out of certain resources, and that's going to be terrible. And this debate is very interesting. It's something that if you've studied politics or economics, you've probably heard about. These ideas have been around for a long time, but where it really cemented itself is in Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which was released in 1968. This is a Stanford biologist who basically warned population growth would result in the exhaustion of resources and a global catastrophe. Basically, once we get to that tipping point, there'd be mass starvation and death, and populations in the world would spiral out of control. And this is something we should definitely look into and make sure we never reach this point. And this debate can obviously go off in many different directions. The more contemporary versions is the global warming debate, which obviously talks about resource usage and depletion, but with the added layer of what the emissions and byproducts of resource usage does to the environment. So we see in contemporary politics how this book is very influential. However, there's a lot of debate on this. I know a lot of people listening to this will be like, well, of course it's true. If you have finite resources, then of course you're going to run out. And yes, in theory that's true, but there's also alternative theories and alternative approaches to actually look at that. So famously, Julian Simon, who was a professor of economics at the University of Maryland, wrote a rebuttal book called The Ultimate Resource. Basically, he makes the argument that humans themselves are the ultimate resource, that if we face issues, our creativity and ingenuity, it will be enough to overcome them, and that we should put more faith in humanity, and that we actually see this play out. And so he basically talks about our intellect, capability to evolve and adapt and come up with creative solutions to problems. We'll be able to overcome resource scarcity. What that comes down to is using resources in different ways, or finding alternatives to resources, or inventing alternatives to certain things that don't need as much resources as they did before. And we actually do see how this plays out. We see in the history of invention in economics that we invent things that require a lot less resources, or are able to use alternative resources which are more plentiful. And that's actually a really cool thing that humans do. For example, one of the greatest inventions in modern history is the transistor. The transistor essentially allowed for the process of computer miniaturization to begin. So before the transistor, we did the vacuum tubes. That's how we powered televisions, radios, and early computers. It was vacuum tubes. We had big reels and stuff like that. The problem with that type of invention, even though they were very practical for their time, they spend a lot of resources. They take more resources to actually build. The energy consumption to actually use them is a lot higher. Now we're at a point, thanks to the transistor, where the phone in your pocket has more computing power than the computers that were being used to get the Apollo mission on the moon. The computers we have now, they use less resources, they use less energy, and they're better than the computers and televisions and radios that they had back in the 40s. And they use less energy and less resources to make. So that's one way. Another way is just changes in perception and habits and cultural influences brought on by new inventions. So at one time, there was fear that New York streets would be covered with a layer of just horse poop because there was so much traffic all over the place. And traffic at one time was horse and buggies. And as more horses and buggies were coming into the city because of population booms, you had a situation where people were actually afraid that there'd just be a layer of poop. And to be honest, if there was no changes and the trajectory of habit and invention was exactly the same, that probably would have happened. However, we not only invent the car, but thanks to Henry Ford, we invent a process for mass producing cars so that they're more accessible to your everyday person at a lot cheaper of a price. Not to mention, the invention of cars also basically ushered in the modern day assembly line, which allowed for stuff to be made at scale for a lot cheaper, and we see a situation where humanity is improved. Now, that caused its own problems. We avoided the problem of New York being covered in a layer of poop, but now cars release emissions, and that's obviously a problem. And now we're in a situation where the technology is not quite there yet, and there's definitely big problems to overcome, but we're inventing EV cars and EV trucks. And yes, in 20 years, there's going to be some other big problem to overcome, but it's important to recognize that we do evolve past these problems, that we invent things that require less resources, or if not, at least alternative resources that are more plentiful. And this is something we see throughout human history. However, with all that being said, it's not that the population bomb is completely wrong. There is such thing as a finite resource. So what does that mean? How do we know whether we would run into that problem? How does all the different planets in the MCU, how do they avoid that problem? And obviously when you talk about a universal scale as opposed to the world is a lot smaller than the universe. But theoretically, the universe would, at a much larger scale, have the same problem. We can talk about human ingenuity, and in the case of the MCU, it wouldn't just be humans, it would be any species with sapience. What happens? Theoretically, that should be true, just on a bigger scale, that certain resources are finite. Well, it seems, if we look at our own history, the determinant factor when it comes to innovation is the economic and government model for which the innovation takes place. And innovation is more likely to occur in those economic systems that meet three requirements. You have to have a highly educated population, decisions are decentralized, and government is supportive rather than a hindrance to business. So, highly educated, that's obviously very important. That comes with both public and private schooling, but whatever approach you take, you have to have a highly educated population, because when people are smart, they're more likely to think past issues and invent cool things. The decentralization is obviously important because ideas can play out in the open market, and the good ones will survive and the bad ones won't. All ideas will get their say, and some inventions will fail, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. What's important is that people are experimenting and trying things out, because for every 100 failures you might only get one success, but that one success could be game changing. It could be the automobile, and that's where this decentralized system is important. Now, when it comes to the relationship between the business sector and the government, when I say the government doesn't get in the way, I don't mean a complete laissez-faire, business can do whatever they want. Actually, in a lot of situations, the opposite of that. What you need is a fair relationship. So, reasonable regulation. You don't want regulation that's just so burdensome that the only businesses that survive are big businesses, because once again, you'll get into that problem of a centralized economic system. Not completely centralized, since it will be among the big businesses, but you'll have less opportunities for good ideas to survive in that situation. So you do want regulation, but you want it to be fair, and you don't want it to be so burdensome that it only favors big business. You also want the government to be there to enforce things like contracts and protect private property, things that give people something to hang on to, incentives to build upon, and stuff like that. Now, there's debates on exactly how much regulation you need. That's something that is worth debating. But on a very basic level, as long as those three elements are met, then you're in a prime position to be able to innovate. And so, assuming the universe in the MCU allows for that, like most civilizations allow for that, then the sapient species of the MCU will be able to overcome the resource collapse that Thanos was fearing. However, if you have a lot of governments and societies with top-down control of the economy throughout the universe, well, then the resource collapse that Thanos was worried about would probably come to pass. And that's the difference. But that's obviously in our real world. Who knows? Maybe it works a little bit different when we start to talk about the entire universe. But presumably, even though it's at a bigger scale, these theories should be able to scale up in that way, especially if there's other sapient species in the universe. If humanity's alone in the universe, then that would be different, because that's a lot of resources among a single planet that we can exploit. But clearly the MCU has shown that the universe is not like that. It's a very populated place. And so we can actually presume that these theories are scalable. Those economic conditions are the difference between Thanos being correct, like the meme says, or actually mistaken.